Okay. So I got this idea to have this discussion when I read this article by E.V. Jiju of the Indian Statistical Institute. And he has 11 good ways which I think are applicable to syncing your Six Sigma project. And he also mentions right here in the middle of the screen that implementations teams should take a few moments and review these and think of the ways of avoiding it. And that gave me the idea of, well, you know, it would be a good idea even before you have a team to sit down and go through these 11 ways and figure it out. So that's what we're doing today. Just to give you an overview about him, Jijo is from the Indian Statistical Institute in Bangalore. He's a specialist in statistical quality control and operational research and holds a master's in statistics. So he's got some good background going into this. And here are the 11 ways that he had listed there. Now, I'm not going to go right here into the 11 ways, but I'm going to talk to you right now about the way I'm going to run this discussion. It's basically I'll bring up each of the 11 ways and a little snippet from his article about describing what that way is. And then I'm going to kind of open it to the floor and ask you all to give your ideas in the chat. So I'd like everybody to at least give one idea in the chat area of how you would avoid this particular way of syncing your project. And I'll give a few moments for that to take place, and I'll read some of them as they come up. And then somewhere along the way, I'll show you a couple of my ideas, which aren't any better than your ideas, I'm sure. And then we'll just kind of move along at an even pace to try and get through all 11 of them. So let's start with the first one here. Poor project selection. Jijo says Six Sigma projects are linked directly to an organization's business metrics and bottom line. But projects are sometimes selected from isolated pockets in departments nobody considers as important to the organization or its customers. And this last sentence kind of got me because it sounded like he was saying that departments that nobody considers are important to the organization or customer. And that may be what he was saying. I kind of read it as the projects themselves that may not be considered important to the organization or customer. So how would you avoid selecting a project that isn't as important to the organization or customer? And so if you would, take moments now and try to put some stuff into the chat box. I'd appreciate it.
Larry Dyer comments, if the executive team ensures that all of the projects are linked to the corporate strategy, you will not select poor projects.
Yeah, we are in the process, in the throes of, we've put in the process excellence leadership team in place for 2 years. And really the first year that it's an evolving thing. We change it all the time, we get better, but the first year we really didn't have linkage between our projects and the corporate strategy. And so we ended up executing projects that were really poor projects that some people didn't care about, projects that didn't have benefits which dropped profits to the bottom line, or other things that were strategy related. So we've redoubled our efforts this year to make sure that we show that linkage is in place so that we don't select those projects.
I don't see other people inputting. Anybody else have some ideas?
Matt comments, take your cues from the big whys already ID'd by senior management, etc. William comments, no projects without executive sponsorship. Cornelio says, let top management do the project selection with Black Belt support. Pramod says, do not take the project until the customer is feeling the pain or problem in the particular process or product. Julie says, it is critical to make sure you are viewing the entire value stream so that your project improvement does not have an adverse effect on upstream or downstream processes. Sharon comments, those making suggestions for projects must understand the organization's strategy. Sometimes this is not communicated clearly. And Karen comments, steering team that is in the loop of management directives. You'd need a management team that is knowledgeable about and serious about the bottom line driving process improvement and not just in the reactive mode.
Let me get some inputs here. I've got, I'll also talk about a project evaluation. It was one of my inputs to it that at the Pyzdek Institute, at least, we have a Excel spreadsheet where you can evaluate the project to make sure that it's aligned to customer and organization's goals and objectives, and it will be successful. And the other thing I had thought of was the project charter, making sure that you got a high-level sponsor, measurable metrics that are tied to an excellent business case with goals and objectives. Got any others on this one, Tom? That I don't see anything else in chat. Okay, I'm going to go on then to the next one, which is defining defects. And Gijo says, a defect in the service industry resulting in customer dissatisfaction can range from a simple misunderstanding of terminology to complete disrespect by the employee toward the customer. Yet these two outcomes receive the same value in Six Sigma projects because they are defined as a single defect. So how would you avoid having this type of occurrence happening so that the defect is that not all the same defects are looked at the same way, so to speak, or groupings, in this case, dissatisfied customers or customer dissatisfaction? And I'll go ahead while you're thinking about it. Is that Stan? Let's see. That's Stefan mentioned using a weighted system. Excellent, excellent idea. I thought of Pareto analysis of root causes of the defects, so that you may have a particular defect like customer dissatisfaction, and you could analyze that or weight that by a frequency.
Cornelio says, defects should be categorized from the customer perspective. Pramod says, you should have clear operational definitions of measurement system and defining defects. Steve says, in fact, this is one of the dangers of Pareto charts with frequency on the vertical scale.
Yeah, Karen had the same thing. Have some detailed definitions, minor to critical.
It's better to convert the vertical scale to dollars or something that indicates customer pain.
Good point. Good point. That'd be an interesting scale to do. Okay, I also had weighted defects like the first comment that we had. How about training variations, the next one? Frequently, organizations customize the Six Sigma concept during implementation. But in the name of customization, training and consulting organizations dilute the curriculum and duration of training for the Six Sigma Black Belts and Green Belts. So how would you avoid training variations? In an organization? I mentioned here compare value, not price only. In other words, sometimes you get what you pay for, so you have to think about that. And Another thing would be review several training organizations and see what fits into what you're trying to get. And then once you pick somebody, listen to who you hire, because sometimes there is a tendency to force a consultant or a training organization to cut it down. I know that I had the experience of having someone ask me to make black belt training into 1 week or green belt training into 1 day, and you can do that, but you miss the body of knowledge, so to speak, in there.
Yeah, we actually evaluated several sites before we made a selection, and I've worked with other black belts that have been trained at other sites like Villanova, and they exclude quite a bit of the body of knowledge from their training. So it was important to us that we have a site that taught the entire body of knowledge, so that was one of the reasons why we went to the Pyzdek Institute.
Also, William had a good input there about not everybody has to be certified, and there are different level of knowledge that every organization needs, or individuals in an organization needs, and so that's a good comment. Not everybody is needed to be certified at a particular level.
Cornelio comments, I think training variation is required to adapt to the actual needs of each company. Richard says, for me, the problem would be that customization leads to a range of ills, training being only one of them. Karen says, require a certification from an institute that is valued by experts in the field. Steve says, once the training is complete, start grassroots efforts where employees meet to learn from each other. In fact, we do that here at Whatcom County, Washington, where interested parties from different companies meet to learn from each other. This is a very effective method because you get to see case studies from different industries. William says, don't shortchange soft skills. Steve says, my point here is that training is only a starting point and that it should be made clear to employees that are provided with third-party training.
There are some other ones that deal with customization, which I think is a good idea from a standpoint, because sometimes Six Sigma is kind of a basic set of training and tools. And I think some customization can be done to emphasize certain things and less so input on others. But there are some basic tenets of Six Sigma that you need to have when you go through a customization. You need to have somebody with some background and knowledge to know you can't leave that segment out. For instance, one of the DMAIC steps, just to take controls off at the end, would be a dramatic impact. And so when you tailor or trim something to the company, sometimes you want to make sure you don't tailor out something that's extremely important. So you need someone with some background and knowledge in Six Sigma to make it work for you.
What are your thoughts about things like the yellow belt and white belt certifications? There's a move towards increasing the number of belts and to provide training at a lower level of competency for people who may not need the entire green belt or black belt skill set. For example, the ISAC, International Association for Six Sigma Certification, has defined a yellow belt body of knowledge, and the yellow belt body of knowledge emphasizes the define, measure, and control steps and actually leaves out most of analyze and improve. In fact, nearly all of analyze and improve. And these folks, of course, can't really complete a project on their own. They have to work with other black belts, green belts, and master black belts, but they do have a role to play in the organization, and they apparently this is considered an important certification.
My 2 cents, Tom, is that I think they're important, and like several of the other attendees here have mentioned, not everybody has to be certified green belt or black belt. Where I used to work, it was at Raytheon. There was a level of almost like a white belt. It was kind of a general knowledge that everybody needed to have about what Six Sigma is and the cultural change that they were trying to make happen, so that different levels of training for people in an organization is good and necessary, I think. That's my 2 cents on those.
Pete, how long was the white belt training that you guys did?
It was 6 weeks, basically broken over 6 months. So we had a week of training and then a week, about 3 weeks of application and working on the job with it to some degree, and then go into the next week of training.
For white belt?
For white belt?
Yeah.
Actually, in Raytheon, they didn't really call it, well, they didn't call black belt black belt. It was just kind of an orientation, and they had a couple of hours that all employees went through, and eventually in the hiring process, everybody went through that presentation. And there I had somebody go through it.
Okay, because we did, when we call white belt 4 hours of orientation, and we have another session that's 1.5 to 2 days, and we call that yellow belt. But one of the things that we do is the whole first day is a simulation where we are simulating a broken process and then going through the entire DMAIC to fix it. And by the end of the day, they see the results of that. And we found that to be a pretty effective way to get the entire concept across.
And I think the breakout of the belts, originally my personal opinion was green belt and black belt. You get too many belts and you don't know what the heck you're talking about. But in reality, I think that's an excellent way for an organization to customize Six Sigma. You still have the main things of black belts and green belts. And then there is a certain body of knowledge that everybody needs to do and know if you're making a cultural change in an organization. And then there are different levels. Maybe they want to have a certain skill set for team members and so on and so forth. And that's a good approach to having some success there.
William says, I agree with multiple level training, but multiple levels of certifications is an administrative expense that I would not pay for. Rick points out that's an educational address. Software is just a tool and it's useless without an understanding of the process. It's an irony that process excellence to not understand the process. Stephen says, to me, white belt and yellow belt training is most useful to identify people that are enthusiastic about the subject and thus worthy of additional training.
That's resources. A valid comment. I've used that quite a bit to identify potential green belt candidates.
Yeah, and William, on the administrative expense for certification that's true if you're doing a lot of outside stuff. I know one of the things that Raytheon did was for their green belt and some of the lower levels of stuff, they would do their own training internally and to the amount that it wanted, and then if there was a completion or project, if not, at least recognize that somebody had that training, with a company certificate that you completed the training. If there was some skill that needed to be demonstrated, once the skill was demonstrated, then you could have a thing. Because when people accomplish something, it's good to reward them that they've done that. That's basically it. But so I don't disagree with you, but because the pay for thing can be very expensive. But a sheet of paper saying you completed something is worth 1,000 words sometimes to an employee. Okay. Statistical training. All types of statistic techniques are taught using software like Minitab, Sigma Excel, and others, without understanding how they are derived. What if software like Minitab stopped giving the estimate of p-values? How would it, how would the black belt or green belt go on is basically what they say. How could you do it if you didn't understand where things were derived from? So how would you avoid this dilemma, so to speak?
Well, it truly is a dilemma because Six Sigma is full of compromises. We take this mix of different subjects and we pick and choose things to put together a skill set to create change agents that are able to go out into the workplace and get things done and make productive change for the organization. But we also can't put everything in there. So if you're a project manager, you're going to know more about project management than we teach in Black Belt training. If you're a psychology major, you're going to know more about small group dynamics and facilitating teams. If you're a statistician, you're going to know more statistics than we teach black belts or even master black belts. So we have a problem, and the problem involves deciding where to draw the line. Personally, in my training classes, what I try to do is to teach some of the basic formulas where I'll actually show a graphic of the formula and explain what the terms mean and explain what the formula itself means or the equation. So, for example, I'll show the mean and illustrate that it's a center of mass and show the standard deviation and variance and explain where they come from. But I don't teach how to derive all of the sums of the squares and mean squares and F-tests that are presented in an ANOVA table. Instead, I really count on the student to understand how to interpret the results of the ANOVA table and the regression ANOVA table without knowing in great depth and detail either the formulas themselves or how those formulas are derived.
We had Cornelia that mentioned that, oops, I just lost it. I was going to read this one. I don't think the user needs to know all the formulas behind. You don't need to be a car mechanic to drive a car. And I think that's kind of what you were talking about, Tom, is that we'll give them some understanding to give some understanding what's happening, but you don't necessarily need to know all the details and stuff in some cases.
Premod comments, focus more on visual Six Sigma techniques. Understanding the basic concepts is the key as compared to statistics. And that's true. The true power of statistics is the use of, or the true power of Six Sigma statistics is the use of analytic methods as opposed to enumerative statistical methods, and those are largely graphical. Things like scatter plots in place of regression analysis are very common. And even though we do teach regression analysis to black belts, it's not always necessary to get the job done. Control charts, etc. are also more common. Richard says, aren't there various levels of statistical use that can be geared to white, yellow, green, etc.? Yes, Richard, that's certainly true. And, we do tend to save the most advanced things for the master black belts and go in terms of complexity downward in the teaching of statistics until at some level white belts, for example, will get a very, very basic, pretty much graphical toolkit. Steve points out Minitab's built-in help and stat guide provide more detail and statistical insights to those that need it, and that's true. And there's also an e-learning handbook available on the internet. There's a link to it in our forums and on my blog. And it's free, and it's paid for by taxpayer money, so it's yours. You might as well enjoy it. Karen says, when I was teaching stats, I required the students to do simple examples by hand and did not allow computer usage until we had gone over the techniques. I believe that they do need to know the formulas to have an ability to interpret results clearly. So Karen, it sounds like you're kind of old school. I'm kind of a mix. I used to be in your shoes, but I've backed off a little bit and rely more now on technology than I used to. William has a very practical approach. He says, when I'm stuck on stats, I pick up the phone. Matt says, more important to understand how to collect the right data and how to pair that with the right analytical tools and how to interpret the resultant output like p-values. And I agree wholeheartedly, Matt. And William says, as stated earlier, not everyone needs to be an advanced statistical guru. Certainly true.
And I think that most of the software are kind of standardized on a lot of things, like the earlier commenter made. Most of them also have some type of help guide and explaining what it means and understand. So I think a little bit of the training, like she mentioned, simple examples, and then the detailed stuff, maybe you'll understand where the more complex stuff is coming from. I like William's comment, when I'm stuck on stats, I pick up the phone. So he calls it. And that's a good idea. You know, when you get stuck on some stuff, just pick up the phone and call somebody who might be able to answer the question. Shoddy certification. Because there's a huge demand for certified black belts and green belts in the job market, every organization searching for employees with a Six Sigma background looks for certification. That leads to job seekers gravitating toward low-cost, easy-to-get certifications. So how do you avoid a shoddy certification? I think both what should address here is not just the job seekers, but the organizations looking for employment. As Stephen says, stick to Six Sigma or to the Pyzdek Institute. Well, I like that idea, but yeah, I give the kids.
Matt comments, what is needed is a trustworthy, authoritative, and objective voice who can help candidates qualify providers in advance. Damien says, what do you think about black belt certification from companies? I think it is worth it for green belts from my personal experience. Richard says, as a PMP, a project management professional, I understand why they are so protective of their license. I would have thought an organization such as ASQ, as a well-known brand, would have taken the lead. As a fellow of ASQ, Richard, I agree with you. However, ASQ had revenue problems and they decided that they would pursue the commercial path. So they now provide training, and as a training company, I don't believe they're eligible or qualified to credit other training organizations, which would, after all, be competitors to them. William says, certifications and recertifications, regardless of the profession, seem to be a revenue perpetuation scheme. Even across companies with great reputations, there are some less than stellar practitioners. Very true, Richard. Matt says, related topic, some certification providers provide lifetime certification while others do not. What are the pros and cons? We provide lifetime certification. However, there are others who require that you maintain professional development. And we simply don't want to be in the business of being sure that you get the adult education and professional development training. But of course, we do recommend it. However, a pro would be, of course, that you'd at least be continuing your education. A con would be the cost, the problem of reapplying every so many years for certification, and assessing the relevance of your training vis-a-vis your certificate. Are there any institutions rating the organizations providing certificates? Other than the ISAC, the International Association for Six Sigma Certification, and their website is isac.org, there are none that I know of that assess the organizations providing Six Sigma certificates. The universities are assessed as universities, so their accreditation body is looking more at bureaucratic processes than they are at content. Can anyone provide a list of shoddy providers to avoid? Well, Matt, maybe someone else on this group can do that. You maybe can start a chat in at sixsigmatraining.org, all spelled out. Start a post a forum, post a blog, and see if you get any comments on that. I don't want to get into that, of course, because I'd be assessing competitors, and I don't think I can be objective. Damien comments, in France, people can certify through accredited consulting, but delivered by our top engineer schools. So that's, certainly a benefit if you had access to that, with the caveat being that you don't want them to be too focused on academics. What about ISO for standards or a checklist? ISO does have a draft Six Sigma standard. It hasn't been issued yet, but it does define the body of knowledge, and it's pretty much what Isaac has defined. Matt comments, Villanova is a reputable university, yet folks stated earlier they do not include the entire body of knowledge. This is frustrating for those seeking more training. Agree, Matt, and unfortunately you're going to have to assess the institutions.
Yeah, my comments were kind of, I like where this discussion is going, because if I'm going to go ahead and bring up the other ones that I had. And it's similar to what I said before about, green belts and black belt training being short or long. Certification's the same way. I think it needs to, in this case, show the demonstration of skills. So I think that's what certification does, and a continuation of that.
Matt asks, can anyone provide a detailed checklist to use to evaluate providers? I did see a checklist that looked at several providers, Matt. It was at the website www.world-class-manufacturing.com. Pat says, the Lean Six Sigma group at LinkedIn did have a recent discussion of recommending Six Sigma training. That's true. It was very lengthy and very thorough and in-depth, and I thought it was very well done. Someone's asking for draft ISO standards. I'll make a note of that.
As far as details of checklists to evaluate providers, I think the best thing I can think of is, I think there are places that the body of knowledge for any particular level are out there. ASQ has one. They're in several books. And I think that's kind of the checklist for if you're getting a good overall training and certification. How about the next one? High attrition rate. As organizations implement Six Sigma, the demand grows for qualified black belts and green belts. Hence, retaining certified black belts and green belts is a challenge for every organization, especially IT and business process outsource industries. How would you address this high attrition rate? And I'm going to, real quick, because I know people will comment, I'm going to talk about organizations need to reward and recognize black belts and green belt successes. I mentioned pay raises, stock options, but I also have a book that's called 1001 Ways to Reward Employees. And so it doesn't always have to be a monetary value, but I think if they're not recognized and rewarded for being successful in a company, they have a tendency to want to leave and find somebody that does recognize them.
Matt comments, this is nothing new. William says, retention could be proportional to the rewards. Many organizations think loyalty is a one-way street that leads only to their doors. Matt says, another option is to pay them a percentage of either the cost reductions or the profit growth for that their project produces. Cornelius comments, give the green belt or black belt management responsibilities and replace them with new ones. And that's a great idea, Cornelio. That was the way Lean Six Sigma got its start. These were temporary change agents that moved back into the organization after 2 or 3 years. And that has the additional advantage of putting Lean Six Sigma thinking into key places and into the organization's DNA. Pramod says, career plan versus opportunity in organizations for black belts.
In fact, when I used to work at Raytheon, I'd suggested to upper management that the black belts be awarded 10% of the cost reduction that they happened upon. And that would be an incentive for the black belts to perform well, or they decide they're not really that interested in doing that type of a job. But that didn't go over either. Farley says, career plan versus opportunity in organization for black belts. And that's a good point. A lot of places have to develop, if you're going to have green belts and black belts in your organization, some career path or plan for those folks, how they grow and move in an organization. All right, I guess I'll go on to the next one. Relying on Gemba. In most Six Sigma projects, the implementation team performs extensive brainstorming sessions and identifies many potential causes that can create variation in critical to quality characteristics. These potential causes need to be validated based on data collected from the process. But due to the difficulty of collecting and analyzing data, many teams try to use Gemba as a validation method for the causes. So how would you avoid using Gemba as a validation method for causes? I mean, as people are thinking about that, I'll go in here. I mentioned that the charter should have measurable metrics, and those metrics are what we need to work toward. And brainstorming tends to give us opinions, but I always like to talk about what Six Sigma really is about, is collecting facts and data to give us results that back or don't back the opinions, and that are related back to the metrics of the charter.
Steve says, I don't understand this point. And I agree with Steve. I don't see where Gemba is exclusive of data collection. I think the two are complementary activities. I think when you go to see what the customer is doing, you do take notes and you do record data and you do quantify your observations, as well as learn just what the customer is doing, and as well as developing a qualitative appreciation for what the customer is doing. So qualitative and quantitative observations need to be undertaken when you're involved with Gemba, which, by the way, for those who don't know, that's just going to the customer and seeing what the customer does.
I tend to agree with you. When I saw this, I kind of thought, well, Gemba's, usually you're going out there with some type of a data collection system because you want to see how and capture what's going on in the process. But I look like what he was implying here is that they didn't really collect anything. They just went out and saw that, oh, did this work or didn't it? Or would this work? Made some opinion without facts and data.
William says, I use availability of data as a project qualifier. He goes on to say, no data, no project. Richard says, My projects require ROI evidence. Richard says, is this point equating Gemba to empirical evidence rather than quantified evidence? That could be what he's getting at there. Just all qualitative is not good enough. Matt says, one can never have too much voice of the customer and should use it to drive an understanding of what they are doing with their projects.
Or the Gemba first order thinking, 80% effective is what Kim said.
Yeah, I would go back and find another data source. I mean, I'd use valid data to validate causes. We use Gemba a lot of time to do our initial data collection, but when you're validating causes, I'd want to be able to collect some data to do that. I use check sheets a lot for that.
Yeah, yeah.
I haven't personally, no.
I have. I've gone out and collected information or data basically with a check sheet as a Gemba process, you know, as you're walking out there on the floor and seeing if this happens or that happens or whatever, or even collecting defect information on a particular product as it's rolling off a line. You can, you know, the inspector's going through, you could mark it as what type of defects are coming off there.
Some other comments from Steve. Not only do I rely on Gemba, I spend 90% of my day at Gemba, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Matt says, brainstorming without VOC is useless. Cornelio says, rigorous data collection in Gemba is essential, but you can't always rely on the operators to do the job. True. I think that the team members who are doing Gemba need to perform that role themselves. William says, I've seen a number of workplaces where data is not collected on a routine basis. Hard to believe. Hard to believe, but I've seen it too, William. Richard says it seems to be better. Larry says, I would never use Gemba to validate causes. Rick points out that anecdote is not the plural of data, so anecdote plural is not data. Stephen says, but don't we collect the best data at Gemba? I think we have a problem with semantics here. Could very well be. We do get our best data firsthand. There are no filters. There are no second parties involved. Matt says, seems to me one can integrate data collection and validation into the Gemba activity and vice versa. I agree entirely with that, Matt. And finally, Damien says, I think one should follow and not take shortcuts. Follow the Six Sigma methodology, which we all know includes validating or nullifying hypotheses about the validation of CTQ or the relevance of them. This next to Gemba activities and data collection. So yes, it's not an either or situation, Damien. I agree. It's an and situation. You do both.
Well, it's a little after 10 or close to 10, Tom. So maybe we should arrange to do the rest of this some other time if folks are interested in that.
So I see that there is a great deal of interest from the comments, and let's go ahead and schedule a follow-on webinar. We'll do that a week from today at the same time, and you all get a link to it, and we'll see you for part 2 of the 11 ways to sync your Six Sigma project. Thank you for attending.